Coming up next, we're joined on the first segment of this morning's call-in program by Jeremias Chitunda, Vice President of UNITA, which is the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. Mr. Chitunda is here to talk about continued fighting in Angola and the role of the U.S. in Southern Africa.
C-SPAN is a non-profit cooperative created and supported by the cable television industry as a public service to its national cable television audience. In addition, C-SPAN is underwritten in part by the following.
This is the inside of what moves your car.
For 10 years, C-SPAN has given Americans an inside look at the forces that move our society. That's why the UAW is a proud sponsor of C-SPAN.
Keep on moving, America.
Coming up next, we're joined on the first segment of this morning's call-in program by Jeremias Chitunda, Vice President of UNITA, which is the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. Mr. Chitunda is here to talk about continued fighting in Angola and the role of the U.S. in Southern Africa.
Jeremias Chitunda, Vice President of UNITA in Angola. What's the latest news you have from Angola? Is the fighting at a lower ebb now, or is it increasing?
Unfortunately, fighting continues at a very intense pace. The MPLA Luanda regime continues to carry out bombing raids against many of our positions. The provisional capital of Jamba, our capital, has been already bombed twice, and even as I speak to you today, more people are being killed instead of resuming the peace process and signing of the ceasefire. So this is the sad aspect of the situation right now. This is a full-fledged offensive which Rwanda has launched against us since mid-December, and it continues to this very moment.
I want to ask you about, in this morning's Washington Post is an article, Secretary of State Baker urged to aid ANC in South Africa. American group cites U.S. funding for solidarity as precedent. This is an article by John Kushko. A group of prominent black Americans yesterday urged Secretary of State James Baker to provide $20 million to the African National Congress to help it become a fully functioning South African political party. But participants in the meeting said Baker was non-committal. That's the opening of this story, but I'm going to drop the paper to continue on. Randall Robinson, Executive Director of Trans-Africa, characterized the meeting as constructive, but said Baker had disagreed sharply with Trans-Africa's recommendation that the United States formally recognize Angola's Marxist government and end the approximately $50 million in military aid it now supplies to UNITA. What do you think of this meeting?
Well, first of all, it's very unfortunate that at this very moment when the black American leaders should be accounted upon to exert their influence to accelerate the peace process in our country, they are not being heard from. On the contrary, they continue to talk about cutting off U.S. assistance to us at a time when the Soviet boats are continuing to unload day and night very sophisticated weapons in very huge quantities to carry out the massacre of our people, at a time when the peace process and the negotiations towards durable peace and effective national reconciliation, these efforts are not enjoying the kind of support that leaders, black American leaders, should indeed be able to provide to us. To provide this sort of support to both sides of the conflict in Angola so we can stop the senseless rounds of killings. The alternative, if we do not continue to resist the best possible way, if UNITA does not resist, the alternative had to be to surrender to the totalitarian one-party rule, which would be very anachronistic to the profound changes that we see all around us in the world. It would also be a betrayal of the very ideals for which the Angolan people have been resisting for so long, first against Portuguese colonial rule, and now against the Soviet-Cuban supported MPLA regime for 15 years. We want free and fair elections and democracy in Angola. We want free and fair elections, multi-party democracy in Angola. This is the goal. This is the basis for achievement of any durable peace. And we are very fortunate to enjoy the support not only of the overwhelming majority of the Angolan people today in this resistance, but also of the international community at large. Therefore, the United States position of providing us with the effective and appropriate support, a position which is supported by the majority of the American people and the United States Congress, is the healthiest and most helpful way to help Angolans in general achieve peace and progress and prosperity.
The groups that were represented in the meeting with Secretary Baker, Trans-Africa, NAACP, the Southern Africa Support Project, have you had the opportunity to meet with representatives of those groups to present your case?
We have not met, but we have definitely conveyed our message. We have conveyed our request that they should play a constructive role in bringing about peace in Angola through so many other channels and to so many other prominent African Americans here in Washington.
Good morning. Welcome to our program. We're spending the next 45 minutes talking about U.S. policy in Africa, specifically related to Angola. We invite you to join in our discussion with your questions and comments. The number's at the bottom of your screen if you're in the Eastern or Central Time Zone, 202-628-2525. If you're out west, 202-783-2727. When you phone in on those numbers and it's ringing, that means you have reached our switchboard in the back. Stay on the line. Your call will be answered in turn. Our guest this morning here to take your questions and comments about the U.S. role in Africa and Angola is Jeremias Chitunda. He's Vice President and Head of Administration Coordination for the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, which is called UNITA. Previously, he was a former UNITA Secretary of Foreign Affairs and representative in the U.S. He was UNITA Secretary for Information and representative in France, a UNITA observer at the United Nations, and Minister of Natural Resources in the transition government of Angola. He has a degree in mining engineering from the University of Arizona. You mentioned earlier that the government, the MPLA, was being supplied by the Soviet Union. Can you give us an idea to what extent, how much money, how many arms, how many people?
The Soviets have been delivering weapons to the MPLA to the tune of $1 billion a year. In this recent campaign, military campaign, the present offensive, which they have launched in December last year, alone, some $900 million have been invested in it. The most sophisticated weapons are being delivered to the MPLA. That includes the Sukhoi 25 and the MiG-25 bombers, the BTR-60s, BRDM, BMP-1 armored personnel carriers, armored reconnaissance vehicles, armored assault vehicles, the M46 cannons. All of these weapons are being delivered in very, very large quantities. And today, the MPLA's army is probably the best well-supplied army in the whole Southern African subcontinent.
Houston, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I would like to ask the brother how they in Africa today, after the people and them had took us from Africa and shipped us away and then spread us all over the world. We Africans that want to come back to Africa, what they have, if they have any study to bring the love into the people to know that they had took us away, but we need to come back home to help to what happened to Africa today. Without us, that knows for sure that we are Africans, and them Africans that born in America is causing a lot of things to Africa. And we need to educate them and don't let them systemize and program like they are to join Army, Air Force, Marine, to condemn, to help this country kill our brothers and sisters in Africa. We must wake up and we must come together, and I want to know if there is any way in Africa that we can come in, because we know for sure that we want to come to Africa to help Africa. and we want to come back home. If there is any way that we can come back home.
Thank you, Houston.
Well, I'm quite sure that, as you have seen earlier in this program, a group of African-American leaders have been at the State Department to discuss with the Secretary of State Baker about the United States policies for Africa. Naturally, black Americans or African Americans have a role, a very important role to play in helping to shape the United States policies for the African continent. It is therefore extremely important for us to see this consciousness of those willing really to contribute with the correct ideas, with the correct influence, so that policies and efforts to dignify the peoples in the African continent would indeed be shaped. Nevertheless, there is a much, much bigger role to be played by the individual African country. It is extremely important to make an introspective analysis, to become self-reliant, to become self-confident in what can be done by the individual people, not only in its own struggle to become truly free and independent, but also to achieve social and economic progress, because in the long run, this is what can put us much more dignifyingly in the fold of truly free nations in the world.
Miami, good morning.
Yes, sir. My comment is basically semantics in terms of the black people or African-American people here in America and our people in Africa. I think it is high time, as far as the cultural understanding, that we all connect and acknowledging that we are Africans here in America. It has been a long time for the African-American people here to go from being called black to now Africans. So I'm reaching out to my brothers in Africa and my brothers here in America and understanding, number one, that we all are Africans. I think when that point takes place and we identify with Africa as being home and Africa identify with us in America, sometimes called black Americans, as Africans, we will culturally affect each other, which would enable us to come together more unified to create a better situation in Africa as well as in America. Everyone else is Irish Americans, German Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans. We're either American Negroes or black Americans. But to my brother on the platform, we are Africans here and we are Africans at home. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Miami. Jeremias Chitunda.
Thank you very much for that comment. I could not agree more with you. Nevertheless, we do recognize this specificity of the United States of America, where in this profound diversity lies the strength of democracy, of the institutions of the country as the freest nation on earth. And we wish very much this sense of independence, this sense of abiding love for democracy and for freedom, which is shared by all Americans, whether they are black, whether they are white, or whether they are yellow, to be contagious to us, to our continent, so that you, as black Americans, can also exert your own influence to help your fellow Africans, your brothers, which we are, to raise the standards of living, to indeed make Africa a continent that you could all be proud of, and you could all feel once again totally at home.
Grand Junction, Colorado, good morning.
Yeah, why does he feel he has a right to everything the whites have built up in South Africa and Namibia and all those places? The ANC is a communist front group. Why should the whites kowtow to them?
Thanks, Grand Junction.
Well, I'm quite sure that the problems of South Africa are very complex indeed, but very fortunately, all South Africans, irrespective of the color of their skin, are now trying very hard to overcome the crippling problems they've been living for many, many years, are now trying hard to come to a solution so that South Africa, too, can become a home and a country truly at peace with itself, and prosperous for all of them. We think significant changes have already taken place, including the release of Mr. Nelson Mandela quite recently. We hope very much that this cooperation among all of them will prevail above whatever ideological differences there may be at the present moment.
Does South Africa have a role now in the fighting in Angola?
Not anymore. South Africa, with the tripartite agreement that was signed in December 1988 towards the application of UN Security Council Resolution 435 for the Namibian independence, and in which agreement there were also provisions for the withdrawal of the Cubans from our country, South Africa ceased supporting us, and in a few days' time, next week, Namibia will proclaim its independence, and we think that is where practically whatever role South Africa had played on Angola will end. But South Africa as a country, South Africa as a regional economic power will continue to play a role for peace, for stability, and for progress in the whole African subcontinent.
Shreveport, Louisiana, good morning.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Bobby, calling from Shreveport.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'd like to express my opinion as being an African American here. And I love my country, Africa, where I'm from. What I'd like to know also is how do we get back to where we came from? One comment that I would like to make is that when will the white people realize that they're being used as a tool of Satan when they persist in destroying black people or destroying people all over this whole earth? They're responsible for provoking clashes in among the black gangs here in the U.S. They're also responsible for the destruction that's taken place in Africa, even to cause clashes between black on black. All of that is provoked by white people. But white people don't realize that they're being used as a tool of Satan in order to kill off black people. This is one thing that white people need to wake up and realize.
Thank you, Louisiana, for the call. Comment?
Well, my only comment on that is that our experience in Angola, in Africa, going first from colonial oppression and then through various kinds of totalitarian rules, oppressive rules by Africans against Africans, by blacks against blacks, and finally through the new kind of terror and tyranny that was being perpetrated in Angola by the Soviets and the Cubans, who have imposed on us a regime of their own choice, not of the choice of the Angolan people. Those are the problems that really are fundamental to the human misery, human oppression and tyranny as a whole, and those are the problems that we would like to try to overcome, to fight against. And we believe in these efforts for freedom and for the dignity of our people in Africa. We are very happy to acknowledge the fact that the support from the international community, from freedom-loving peoples all over the world, regardless of the color of their skin, most importantly, the role that the United States of America has been playing indeed for Angola to achieve its freedom and dignity, to have free and fair elections and democracy against the Soviet and Cuban sponsored tyranny. This is indeed heartwarming, it's extremely important, and we only wish everybody to join those efforts so that the killing of blacks can stop in Angola, the killing of blacks can stop in South Africa, and that the killing of men by men can stop all over the world. We need freedom, we need peace, we need stability, we need love towards one another. We believe this is what religions, irrespective of what denomination we may be talking about, would like to teach fundamentally to all mankind.
Winter Park, Florida, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question, or comment first. I was on the Ile de Sal when, since after the Portugal people pulled out, it was controlled by SWAPO. And SWAPO women stood with guns and would not let us on the tarmac while the train was being cleaned to go on to South Africa. So I want to know from this gentleman how many forces in UNITA does he have to resist the communist influence there in Angola still?
Thank you, Florida, for the call. What are the size of the forces that are fighting?
Let me tell you first that UNITA, the National Union for Total Independence of Angola, was founded exactly 24 years ago, on March the 13th, 1966, by Dr. Jonas Malheiro Savimbi, who is our president. And the organization was founded in order to fight against the Portuguese colonial oppression, colonial rule. 9 years later, in 1975, the Portuguese colonial rule ended. The Portuguese left Angola, but the country did not become independent because the agreement that was worked out between the Portuguese on the one hand and the Angolan freedom fighters on the other had never been honored. It is in order to torpedo that agreement that called for free and fair elections and multi-party democracy. It is in order to torpedo that agreement that the Soviets and the Cubans had come into Angola, have invaded our country. And it is in response to this new form of aggression that UNITA resumed its new resistance to this new foreign occupation. Today, the UNITA army, our army, is 75,000 strong, of which about 40,000 are regular troops and 35,000 are guerrilla fighters. And we have them deployed all around the country, all over the country. We do not have any foreign bases. Our organization was founded and lives on the Angolan soil, inside Angola. We have liberated more than a third of the country. We have very viable administrative infrastructures, but at the same time, we have proved to the Soviet and Cuban armed forces, where the Cuban army had at one point reached a peak of 60,000 Cuban troops in Angola until 1989, when they began their withdrawal. There were thousands of Soviet military personnel. There were East Germans, Bulgarians, Czechs, from Poland. North Koreans were there. So it was an assortment of a foreign army of occupation led and organized by Moscow, which totaled nearly 100,000 people there. They have been scaling now down. The Cubans are withdrawing from our country. All of it in response, naturally, to the effectiveness of our resistance, of what our 75,000 strong army, with the support of the Angolan populations at large, has achieved.
Rochester, New York, good morning. Rochester?
Daytona Beach.
I'm sorry, go right ahead, please.
Yes. I just want to voice my support for the, let me turn this down a minute, this moment, excuse me. I want to voice my support for that African-American delegation that met with the State Department yesterday. Those leaders do represent the vast majority of African-Americans, and I think they were right on the money in doubting what the State Department is doing. I also want to say that I'm terribly sad to see Africans fighting among themselves and killing each other. However, one of the reasons why I am against your organization is because of the support that it has received from South Africa. And we just don't trust in South Africa. We think that they are using you for their own purposes.
Thank you, Florida, for the call. Jeremias Chitunda?
Definitely, the sad aspect of the Angolan conflict is that massive foreign intervention has pitted Angolans against Angolans. From the beginning, in 1975, when the Cuban and Soviet intervention made it impossible for us to hold our free and fair elections, then it became impossible for us to proceed otherwise, except by accepting whatever support we could have from anyone in the international community to enable us to survive. The alternative to accepting any such support would have been the dismantling of the organization, the crushing of the ideal of being truly free and holding free and fair elections in our country. It would have been the end of any such dreams. It is also true that the South African support from us, which has been exaggerated tremendously by our own adversaries, reflected simply the economic predominance of South Africa in the area. It is known to everybody that no country in that area, whether it's Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Botswana, and now Namibia, no country in the whole area, and we are talking about independent African countries, 20 years of independence behind, seem to be able to function without some form of economic cooperation with South Africa. Not that they are condoning apartheid, but there are such basic facts that you all have not been able to overcome, to overrule. When we came to a point where we had to have an outlet for the sale of our own products, and we had to have an external market to buy the things that we wanted to. And more than that, we needed a transit point for the kind of support we received from various friendly countries. In 1976, when we began this resistance, the support from friendly Arab countries, from friendly European countries, had to have a country of transit. And South Africa simply had to be approached, not by us, but by these countries that want to help us so as to reach us. So those are the facts underlying the so-called South Africa connection. But it's also a fact that our contribution, our stand to fight for our own dignity, today cannot be topped by anyone else, by any other freedom-fighting organization in Africa or elsewhere. It is important to put those facts because of the very destructive oversimplification of these complex issues that we have in our country. I'll still come back to the fact that black Americans, they could indeed play a very important role at this particular moment to bring about peace in Angola and through national reconciliation, notwithstanding and whatever the previous divisive reasons that may have been in the area.
Notre Dame, Indiana, good morning.
Good morning. I had a comment and a question. I don't know a whole lot about Africa. My impression of many of the cultures is that they're very macho, and I always feel there's a direct link between a macho approach and war making. And I don't aim to talk just about Africa. I mean, I certainly see that in the United States as well, but, you know, the topic today is Africa. I wanted to ask this gentleman if there is much of a role for women in UNITA, and I feel that women and the influence of female values and universal values is helpful in, you know, coming to terms with war issues and with, you know, bringing about peace. And I wondered, is there a role for women in UNITA? Does he see a role for them in the future if UNITA comes into power as a government?
Thank you, Indiana.
Thank you for the question. Women are playing a prominent role in UNITA, in health services, in education, in administration. They have always played a remarkably indispensable role for us, not only now, but even in our vision of a well-governed Angola, of a peaceful Angola, of a country seeking progress and dignity. The role of women is very well cut out, and it is also obvious that that society could probably not be what it is, and it could not be what we are, were it not for the very important role that women are playing. Women are also, as a matter of fact, in the armed forces. There are high-ranking women officers in the UNITA armed forces, even though they are not supposed to go and participate in combat duties. But in so many administrative activities, they are indispensable.
Long Beach, California, good morning. Long Beach, you with us?
Yes. I have a question and also a comment. First of all, my comment is that I'm proud of being a Black American. I have heard so many times from Africans putting down Black Americans in America. Also, I understand them wanting the Black Americans to help them. But what I don't understand is that during the 60s, where were the Black Africans for us? I do not recall through history ever hearing about the Africans coming over to help us through our civil rights problems here in America.
Thank you, California.
Well, I think there may be some frustrating experiences on both sides, but that only underscores the fact that there is much more in common for everyone to work together for a common cause. It is important, as far as Africa is concerned, even the founding of Pan-Africanism, the very first conferences that were held to try to forge a common denominator, a unifying philosophy in Africa's struggle for freedom, for self-determination, for dignity. Black Americans did play a vital role. Everybody knows of the names of E.W. Du Bois, the names of Marcus Garvey, the names of many of these notable Black American leaders in the beginning who have played a vital role to bring about this unifying philosophy. It's also true that we have seen many, many important notable Black Americans traveling to the African continent to forge economic cooperation ties, to participate in many conferences. So in that role, we only hope very much to continue to grow, to continue to be strengthened. As to the attitude of Africans in relation to Black Americans, maybe the expectations have been all too high over the years. We remember very much when we were kids, our grandparents talking to us in a very, very folkloric way about what Black Americans would do, how they would show up one of these days in clouds from America and come and help liberate our people from the Portuguese colonial domination. So many of these things were being said, so many of these things were being talked about. Naturally, we had to separate the myth from reality, and the myth is that there are difficulties and shortcomings that cannot be ignored, and the reality is that whatever the difficulties, whatever these shortcomings, there is still much more in common, and everybody appreciates the success and the struggle of Black Americans for their own lot, for their own conditions here in the United States. And more than that, it's recognition of the double role that Black Americans have to play. First, because they are Americans, and as such, they are citizens of the most powerful nation on earth, most democratic and freest nation on earth. So they have a responsibility towards freedom for mankind, for humanity as a whole. Secondly, as Black, so they have their own historical and umbilical cords to the African continent, and therefore they too have an obligation to remain interested in the situation in Africa, so that in the end this cooperation can be redeeming to both sides.
Princeton, New Jersey, good morning.
Yes, years ago, our tribal chiefs sold we colored folks into slavery. Now we're doing the same thing in South Africa with Mandela's communism. Why are we selling one another out? And so many of my colored brothers and sisters won't talk up. They're afraid of being called Uncle Toms. Let's talk up for our people. Thank you.
Thanks, New Jersey. Comment? Let it stand as a comment. Yes. Springfield, Ohio, good morning.
Good morning. Can I be here for just a minute with you? Can't pronounce it. Mr. Chitunda? I'd like to say, first of all, as a black African American, I don't understand all the things because the press here just show us certain things. Is it possible you could, of course it is possible you might let the U.S. press in where we could see more of really the conditions there? And I personally will say as an African American that I will help you any way I can by writing Congress. And the other thing I'd like to say, I know Africa is very rich in natural resources all over the country, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. But I'd like to see the African leaders come together, and what I'd like to also do is ask other black African Americans to get together where we can see a more constructive picture about Africa, because basically I'm 47 years old, and basically until, say, the 70s, I've always seen African people portrayed as somebody on a boat, going down a canoe, fighting a snake or crocodile or alligator or climbing a tree after a coconut for a monkey. This is not true for the real truth of Africa, but this is what we have been shown as African Americans pertaining to Africa. And I'd like to see if you could let the press in, and maybe we could get the true understanding. Maybe we could get our congressman, our president, and so forth and so like to give more aid and so forth, because we have given aid to every country in the world that said they were fighting for freedom and democracy. And thank you very much. And would you please comment on those things, please?
Thank you very much. I totally agree with most of what we said, almost everything you said. Naturally, in Angola, in the part of Angola that UNITA controls, our doors have been fully open to allow for journalists, allow for the press, to allow for fact finders to see for themselves the reality of the situation there. We have had the privilege to have many black American journalists and writers, just as we did with people of all races from all over the world. And a unanimous verdict that they have all came up to has been the fact that in the UNITA-controlled part of Angola, self-reliance and the ability to count on our own efforts has been indeed the cornerstone of whatever progress we have achieved. And progress we have achieved because the odds that we have been fighting against in Angola have been extreme. It's a formidable, most powerful army of aggression that we had to face up to from the Soviet Union and Cuba. And nevertheless, what we receive as outside support in order to resist effectively has been indeed really a drop in the bucket, has been indeed the peanuts, the magnitude of that support. So that to every dollar of the material support we receive from outside, we managed to destroy about $100 worth of the lethal Soviet weaponry poured into our country. Why? Because of our ability to rely on our own. We do not have any foreign advisors. There are no foreign technicians of any kind, while the other side is really teeming with mercenaries of all colors. We do not have any sophisticated things. There's no aviation or anything like that on our side. But our people have all enough to eat because we produce all our food. We do not receive any food assistance from anywhere in the world, while the other side survives on handouts from all over the world. Angola is a country very, very rich in natural resources, as you have pointed out in relation to the African continent as a whole. We have mineral resources. The land is very fertile. We have a lot of water in the country. The coast, the sea, is teeming with fish and so on. But it's important to underscore once again the value of the human resources. Developing our own human resources, manpower is the most important challenge for us, because as long as we can continue to rely on ourselves, as long as we acquire the skills that are necessary to develop our country, then the potentials, the economic potentials are going to become a reality. And once again, is the human value, the human element that for us has indeed the priority. Again, we hope very much that you personally would have a chance to come and visit us, so you can then come out and tell the world that indeed Africa is not a lost cage, not a lost continent, and in Africa it's not just misery. It is the potentials, it is the resources, plus a people committed to indeed pursue as vigorously as possible the ideals of freedom, the ideas of dignity, and the ideas of economic and social prosperity.
Stockton, California, good morning.
Yes, I wish to thank Jonas Savimbi. I think he's doing a tremendous job down in Angola fighting for freedom. I was wondering, don't you feel a little discouraged when you come up here and you see Randall Robinson, Jesse Jackson, Coretta King, and our State Department and all the liberal media supporting your communist enemies?
Well, we recognize that this is perhaps a characteristic of democracy, is to find in the United States people of all ideological and political persuasions. But we are not at all frustrated. I do not feel frustrated. Not feel frustrated because indeed the majority of the American people, the people that are receiving us very well in the administration, in various other organizations, mainstream America is with Dr. Savimbi. Mainstream America is with the Angolan people's search for free and fair elections, democracy, freedom, and dignity. So on that, I am very satisfied, notwithstanding what Mr. Randall Robinson and his friends may be standing for.
You've had your own meetings in your trip here. You met with the Vice President, also members of Congress. How would you characterize those meetings and the response you received from Vice President Quayle and members of Congress?
The response has been very heartwarming, very adequate, and we are very happy.
Next call is from DeKalb, Illinois. Good morning.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment and ask a question. My comment is that perhaps the African-American leaders advocate a cutoff of aid to UNITA because they feel that you do not represent forces of justice and democracy. My question is, how do you feel about the suggestion from these African-American leaders of U.S. financial support to the ANC, and what is your relationship with the ANC?
Well, first of all, to represent the forces of freedom and democracy in Angola is to stand up for the principles of freedom and democracy in Angola. This is the only thing that justifies our resistance. We want free and fair elections. We want democracy in Angola. Let us go to the polls, and then there will be no more conceivable reason for anyone to pick up arms and fight in any way whatsoever. We want free and fair elections. We want multi-party democracy. This is what UNITA stands for. This is what Dr. Savimbi has been leading us to fight for. It is the other side. It is the MPLA that very unfortunately seems to be totally opposed to the concept of free and fair elections and freedom for our country. It is also obvious that we are willing to accept the verdict from the ballot box. Let elections be held, and then we will know who is and who is not for freedom and democracy in our country.
With all the changes in Eastern Europe, with the Soviet Union's influence apparently declining there, why hasn't that translated to Angola? Why hasn't the Soviet Union started pulling back its support of the MPLA?
Indeed, it is the paradox today of the duplicity of perestroika. We think perestroika seems to be good for Europe, but perestroika is totally absent in Angola. In Angola, we see Gorbachev with the same face of Brezhnev. In Angola, it is the KGB, it is the military, rather than any attitude, any effort by the Soviet Union to help free and fair elections and multi-party democracy in Angola. Instead of advice, they are unloading weapons to continue to kill our people. It is also obvious that having seen the profound changes that are taking place all over the world, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, East Germany, Lithuania, Nicaragua, Namibia, Chile, having seen all these profound changes. There is no more conceivable reason why the MPLA, the Soviets, and the Cubans in Angola should continue to oppose, to deny the right of the Angolan people to free and fair election and multi-party democracy. This is what is anachronistic.
Jeremias Chitunda, Vice President and Head of Administration Coordination for the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much indeed.
Right now we are